we go. We are online today with Chris from PS Audio. Thank you for find time to share with us all your experience, your knowledge about the new FR10. That's the main topic of today. And maybe you want to introduce yourself a little bit for those don't know you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for having me and speaking with me again. Yeah, we spoke sometime back right when I launched my first speaker with PS Audio. So I've been here
Yeah.
for 4 years now as the senior speaker design engineer. And PS is almost 50 years in the business with electronics, but new to loudspeakers. And so we have now our third model that we've recently launched. It's called the Aspen FR10, and it's another pretty conventional tower speaker. It's 41 inches tall, I guess in metric terms, just over a meter tall, and uses a pair of 180 millimeter woofers and our proprietary planar magnetic drivers for the mid-range and treble. So it's a three-way tower design and substantially more compact than the previous models that we've done. And it's almost where we're finishing the line. We're doing a Standmount monitor as well that I'm just finishing up now, and that'll be our first product line, our Aspen series. So you got to hear the FR10, and again, we just started shipping those this last month, and
Oh,
and so very new. There have not really been any reviews out there other than some user reviews. So this is maybe the first that anyone's hearing about it, other than our initial press release. So you're very early, but that's good.
yeah, was I think I don't know the distributor here in Germany. I'm not sure since how long he has the speaker in the room by in the showroom, but yeah, it was pretty new,
Mhm.
and I had the opportunity to see it closer to the FR30. It's impressive how the FR30 looks so big compared to the FR10.
Yeah, it's a lot bigger than I remember it being when I
Yeah,
see it
yeah,
with
yeah,
these new speakers. I'm like, wow, that's a really big speaker. And this one is more modestly sized. We also took some feedback from Europe and made it in a matte finish because the
yeah,
gloss lacquer isn't for everybody,
yeah.
for especially in Europe. And so we have a matte white and a matte black
Okay,
finish that has been better received. So
okay,
I hope that this will be more of a size, and footprint
okay.
that people could
I
see themselves own.
I look the finish and they are both really beautiful. I think it's something subjective, but it's interesting to note that you from Europe you had this feedback about the matte finish. I'm a gloss lover, so
Okay, well, we should release multiple versions. We're trying to, with new products, keep the number of models down a little bit, but I hope in the future we'll do some more finish options. But that
okay.
was a comment that we received, was that people like the look of the matte finish. It's the same undercoat. We do. There's a lot of coats of paint on there still, but it's
Yeah,
doesn't have the clear coat on the top.
okay. And speaking about the cabinet, it's same materials compared to the FR30 and the FR20.
It really is. It's just mostly a scaled down version size wise. The one thing we did differently was the tweeter is mounted to this in the FR30 is mounted to this composite material that's a thermoset resin with fiberglass
Hmm.
that's very stiff and acoustically dead and something we really like. But I wanted to use that more extensively as part of the cabinet. In the case of the FR30, there are these covers over the woofers that are that, but it's not really integral to the structure of the woofers. But in the FR10, it is. So it's the entire front baffle is made of a thicker piece of this material,
Okay.
and there are brass inserts put into it when it's molded. And so we have these very long shoulder screws that mount from the rear of the enclosure and grab the front baffle. This is something that a couple of other people have done. I've seen, Kef in their reference series and Monitor Audio in their Platinum series have done something kind of similar, not with thermoset resin, but with mounting into aluminum or wood. But in our case, we're doing it into these resin baffles. And so structurally, it's a little bit different
Yeah.
in that way. And I think it looks a little cleaner because you have we have these little covers on the back screws, but it basically grabs the enclosure from behind the front of the enclosure and makes it very rigid. So I think have a little bit of refinement that we've added in on that, because we're trying to bring the cost down too. It's a way to
Yeah.
simplify the construction somewhat, but still give very good performance.
Okay. And speaking actually about size, I had the feeling that because yes, it's smaller,
Mhm.
but it can play in medium-sized room without any problem, in my opinion, because the level of dynamic and scale was pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's something I worked hard on, is to not give too much up dynamically, because you want
Mm.
something to be, minimize the compromise there. Normally, when you go with a smaller speaker, you either have less bass extension or less output in a passive speaker. And in our case, um, the bass extension is still pretty good. It's a corner frequency of 30 hertz in the bass, which is still pretty extended for a speaker of that size. You can be very happy. Most people be pretty happy without a subwoofer. Those subwoofers can smooth the bass response in room quite a bit, but it's and still have good output capability. There are three. They're all new drive units except for our tweeter, and there are three rear-mounted flat piston passive radiators that augment the bass to the 180 millimeter woofers. They're like a 220 millimeter by 180 millimeter kind of oval shaped, racetrack shaped passive, and that does give quite a bit of bass dynamics, and we worked really hard on the woofer to give long excursions so that when you push it dynamically, it will have low distortion in the bass. Specifically, is normally where woofers run out of dynamic headroom. The mid range is actually a new development, and is it's a 200 millimeter tall planar mid range. That's about 96 dB at 1 watt, so it's quite sensitive. We pat it down into the context of the speaker to balance with everything else. But when you have a very high sensitivity mid, I do think that leads to good dynamic response, because the mid's only seeing a fraction of a watt of power most of the time, and then
Mm.
when you call upon it to really have more output, it's still at very low power, so you don't get dynamic compression from it. So that's some of the design principles. The speakers aren't super high sensitivity on their own. They're kind of mid 80s, similar to the larger models, but with good bass extension. So you still want to have a reasonable size power amp to drive them, but I think comfortably you could be 100 watts of power or 150 watts of power. I wouldn't really recommend them for low power tubes or something like that, but as long as you have some power behind them, I think they're pretty dynamic sounding.
Okay. And you mentioned subwoofer. I will come back with an interesting question for you. But before this, looking your design, so
Mm-hmm.
FR10, 2030, it's look like you prefer to use passive radiator instead bass reflex design. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe you want to speak a little bit about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's somewhat uncommon to see passive radiators in the market. There are a number of companies that still do it. They actually function very similarly to a bass reflex port. The thing about a bass reflex port is that if you're tuning low in a small box and you want high output, the port size grows quite a bit, because you need a sufficient diameter to keep the airspeed low in the vent, and then that has to grow in length ratiometrically for a given tuning. So they tend to get fairly long, and then that can cause resonances in the port, like an organ pipe. So you can get these harmonics of the vent, or you can have mid-range leakage come through the port, and have coloration from the port sound. And there's less of that in a passive system, because you don't have this duct that can have these resonances. There are ways to mitigate some of that in ported systems, where they do, um, you know, basically tuned dampers in the port, or like Kef does this rubberized center to the port to try to minimize some of the resonances. And there's other ways to do it, but the PRs are, kind of sidestep that issue by having something, as long as you're in the mechanical limits of the passive, it's very clean sounding. And then the one challenge in passives is you need to make them extremely soft in order to have the same response as a vent, because they have their own self resonance that can cancel ultra deep bass. But we designed them to be very soft and have high linear excursion, so they can move over 25 millimeters peak to peak easily. And so I think they perform pretty well. They are more expensive. You're paying for maybe half the cost of a woofer or more to put a passive in there, and a port is far less expensive than that, depending on how it's made. So it does add some cost to the speaker, but I feel like it's been a good thing for us for this model line, if we're looking for reference quality bass.
Okay, so we can say that is more expensive, and probably it's still going very low because it was going very low.
Yeah,
But probably you got less coloration. It could be.
I think less coloration. The port, people say, well, why don't you do a sealed box? Because there's even less coloration from that. But what they don't realize is that for a given bass extension, you have half the sensitivity of 3 dB less sensitivity. So you end up with these speakers that become either hard to drive, or people make them low impedance to raise the voltage sensitivity some. And you also have half the output around tuning. So in the octave or so around where a port or passive is tuned, you have double the dynamic capability. And that's normally where the woofer is running into problems anyway. So if you also is a distortion reduction device, because what happens right at the port or passive radiator tuning is that the pressure from the resonance of the passives hold the woofer almost still, and that really reduces its distortion there. So it generally is for deep bass, for high output deep bass is a good approach, and we're getting good comments about that. You know, the bass extension and sort of texture and quality down there. So it was a design goal.
Okay. Back on subwoofer, it's also an interesting argument, and I had the opportunity to integrate subwoofer in two-channel stereo system. Is always very difficult, and also by measuring the front speaker with the subwoofer, I always noticed that there was some latency problem on the subwoofer. So something like around 20 milliseconds sometimes. What's your take on it?
Yes, so we're actually working on some subwoofers now, and Paul, the owner of PS, has always advocated for subwoofers. So he says, you know, any speaker system, even large full range tower speakers like what we're talking about, can benefit from subwoofers, because you know the number one challenge in small rooms and domestic sized rooms is that the bass, you know, you have peaks and dips from room modes, and you know you can only really address that by moving your speaker location, seating location, or adding low frequency sources. So when you add more low frequency sources, subwoofers, you can increase the modal density and smooth out the peaks and dips of the room if done correctly. And like you mentioned, the phase and delay of the speakers relative to the subs do impact this. But our audibility of phase at low frequency is very poor. And it's more about getting a smooth response rather than trying to necessarily phase match within a cycle or something of your main speakers. But yeah, if you can get it lower latency, that's great. DSPs and subwoofers tend to add a little bit of latency, like 5 milliseconds just for A to D converters, D to A converters. And then the self-inductance of the woofer itself, so the coil of wire in the woofer, can cause some phase shift, which also is delay essentially. So the woofer acts as if it's a foot or two further back in space than it really is because of this delay. And then also, if people are using wireless subwoofer kits, like some of these like 2.4 gigahertz wireless kits, add something like 20 milliseconds of delay. And when you're in a home theater, you have a lot of capability in the processor to delay your main speakers in order to match, but in HiFi you don't. So one of the things I've been looking at is a wireless transmission standard that uses ultra high frequency, that has very low latency, like it's in the less than 5 millisecond range for wireless. So we're looking at integrating that potentially in our subwoofer products, because you could basically cut out 15 milliseconds of latency from a normal wireless subwoofer kit. So there's not really a penalty of going wireless versus wired because it's a lossless standard and it's low latency. And it's something fairly new. I saw that Sonus Faber is using it in one of their active bookshelf kind of speakers, but
Mm.
not too many people are using it yet. And so that's something I'm looking at as a way to address the latency problem in HiFi, because again, you're limited because you have an analog preamp that's immediate. You don't have the ability to delay things necessarily unless you want to redigitize them. So having a low latency sub would be nicer. I mean, you can always delay it further in time, but you can never, go the opposite direction. So yeah, I think sub integration is something that is critical in a system if you're going to do it, and you've been able to measure and learn about that. But not everyone is really willing to do that. So we're also trying to look at some of these automatic systems for it. I don't think many of them are very good, unfortunately, relative to a trained person that's doing measurements and adjusting it, because a lot of them aren't very deterministic, meaning you get a little bit of a different result every time you try to run their auto EQ. But and also equalization isn't always the answer. A lot of it can be done with, like you say, delay and placement and other stuff. But subwoofers are great. I think thankfully these tower speakers play low enough that if you have a room that doesn't tend to have a lot of modal issues at the listening position, you still have very satisfying bass extension. It's just a lot of rooms do have issues where the ideal place for your left and right speaker from an imaging and high frequency, mid frequency performance standpoint isn't necessarily the best place from a low frequency standpoint in room modes. And so that's why subwoofers are a great tool to add. And I hope we can add some to our product line. But there's some great ones on the market. But we've got some of our own ideas about how to do high performance, low distortion drive units, and want to carry that over into some other products, hopefully in the future.
You mentioned Sonus Faber. They actually released now, I don't know if you saw it, is 700,000 mega system with the subwoofer.
Yeah, big subwoofer towers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
millimeter
They
towers.
they were
Pretty
at the
crazy.
Consumer Electronics Show with that. I didn't go this year. I think they were the only people left in the high end section there, because it used to be a big show for
Yeah.
high end 2-channel audio, and now nobody is showing there anymore, really, except them. I mean, they're a big enough company that they can draw some people, and especially with a big flagship system like this. And I have to say, it looks like there's some serious tech in what they're doing, and they always make a beautiful system. I follow one of their designers on LinkedIn, because he's always kind of doing interesting cosmetic design stuff. I will say, from a speaker voicing standpoint, we don't always follow the kind of direction they do. Our speakers are voiced pretty flat. Like there's not really any particular. I mean, we of course listen and try to make it sound musical, but it's really a lot of measurements and trying to make it neutral. Whereas on some of the Sonus Faber stuff, there's this kind of shallow recess around 3 to 4 kilohertz, and then a slight bump up above 10 kilohertz, and it gives this kind of sweetness and depth a little bit, and also airiness. But it's kind of applied to everything, and I think they tend to sound very beautiful, but I think there's maybe less accuracy when you try to tailor the response more. And that's just kind of a philosophical thing where I try to, have it be something that's more on the neutral end of the spectrum if I can. I mean, of course, there's inherent issues with every speaker based on the physical configuration and type of drive units and stuff. It's not going to be perfect, but we're always trying to make it pretty neutral here, not voice in a particular curve strongly into the response. But I think they do beautiful stuff. So
back on the FR10 and all the Aspen series, it's looked like not many manufacturers are using Planar Magnetic. I mean, I until now saw only PS Audio. There are ribbon tweeter available on some brands, but you looked at you only guys are working a lot on this technology, and the questions is why. I mean, is because for the characteristic, is because I think is also nothing easy to implement in a speaker. Tell me about
Yeah, that's a good question. You don't see it that often, especially in the mid range. You do see some tweeters like that in various companies, like um, you have Piega,
that.
Rido, Borison. There's Wisdom Audio in the custom home audio space does
Mhm.
some planers, and there's people like Magnapan and some larger panel speakers. Like there's this Diptyque and a few others that are now Clarisys that are doing large panel speakers. We're just doing mid-range and tweeters with this because I feel like that's where the technology shines, especially in the mid-range. And the reason why I think it's so good there is that with the traditional cone or dome mid, you're in some form of breakup. So where the diaphragm is not acting as a pure piston and in the range of mid-range. And unless you have very, very small mids and very high crossover, it's just in a traditional speaker with a 5 or 6 inch cone mid, you're in a lot of breakup, and these planar drivers don't have that. Additionally, the steel of a standard moving coil motor and the magnetic system there has a lot of nonlinearities in the mid range where you have these eddy currents in the steel and hysteresis of the motor that causes a bunch of distortion that is pretty objectionable. It's pretty bad. There are companies trying to minimize that, but in a planar you don't have that. There's basically no inductance. There's like in our planar there's like 4 turns of wire, so there's basically no inductive elements, just resistor, and there's no steel in the circuit. It's just magnets, against the diaphragm, and the steel is not modulating like it does in a normal cone woofer. So the speakers distort, but not in the same way that a cone does. It just sounds very different, the way their distortion profile and their response profile. And so this lack of cone resonance, like our planar mid plays out to 10, 15 kilohertz. Like it's very extended and very smooth, and there's no resonances there, and not substantial ones at least. And they also have very inherent high damping. So the diaphragm is about a fifth the thickness of a human hair. It's very thin, and so is the conductor on there. And it happens when you get materials that thin that air itself acts on the diaphragm in a fluid sort of way and makes it stop really fast. So if you look at the decay performance of how fast can the diaphragm stop after you stop the input signal, is among the best of any technology on the market. So those are some of the qualities that I like about them. Historically, they didn't play as loud or weren't as dynamic as a cone mid and wouldn't handle power as well as a cone mid. But with the advent of really high strength neomagnets and higher temperature materials, we can get pretty high output and sensitivity. Like I said, on the FR10 mid, it's a driver that is 96 dB at 1 watt and has about 50 watt power handling. So you can get very high peaks, north of 115 dB out of the mid, even or around that, which is very, very high level output. And the distortion is quite low on it. So yeah, that's part of the reason we've been pursuing it. It is kind of a science project. Each drive unit takes a lot longer to make because it's not symmetrical, and you have to come up with all the fixtures and all of the components of assembly for each unit. It's not kind of just an axisymmetric thing you can put on a turntable like a woofer is. So it's got more expense and development time, but it's also something kind of unique. So we like that aspect too. Not only does it solve some problems, but it's not the same thing that everybody else is doing. So
It's pretty holographic. That's really crazy. And it is a full PS Audio design, this?
yeah, we
Okay.
did all the drive units
Mm.
on it, and it's pretty similar to something I did. I worked at a company in my early 20s. I was about 25, called Bolender Graebner, and the engineer there, David Graebner, had worked for my father. So I kind of and did the some work on planar magnetic drivers when I was about a teenager, and so I kind of grew up around their development and then worked at a company for 5 years that was doing more design for those. So it's leveraging those the designs of the past. So it is similar in concept and construction to some of the stuff that was done at BG, but I've used some new materials and some higher strength magnets and some different damping and stuff. So it's our own design, but it's, you know, it's just an evolution of that stuff that I was working on 20 years ago. I hope we can take it further. I was in contact with a retired engineer that has some interesting ideas about how to get some even more output out of these. So I've been looking at some other concepts. So I hope we can continue to innovate there.
And back on the FR10, if we take a look of the passive radiator, we noted on the FR30 and on the FR20 are on the side,
Yeah.
where on the FR10 are on the back. Could this affect the positions distance to the rear wall? I mean, they will require
that's
a specific distance?
You know, it doesn't affect the distance to the wall. What does affect the distance to the wall is the voicing of the speaker. So there's this thing called baffle step, where as a designer, you assume how far someone is going to place the speaker from the wall by how much you reduce the mid and tweeter output to match the bass output below the width of the front of the speaker. That distance supports. So in our case, that's like 500 hertz. So when you start putting a speaker against a wall that has full baffle step, it starts to lift up, in our case, below like 400 hertz output by a couple dB, and that starts to sound a little full in the low end of a voice or something like that. We tried to voice the speaker where you can place it in a room-friendly place, but that matters more than that voicing. It matters more than ports or PRs on the back of the speaker. Because the port and PR is actually, like, this PR is down at 30 hertz. So you're looking at a super long wavelength. So it's not directional. Like, you could place it on any side of the speaker. The reason we placed it on the side on the FR20s and FR30s, the larger models, is we could horizontally balance the mass, because you have them moving in opposite directions on either side of the box. So there's less enclosure vibration. But then in placing it on the rear, you don't get that vibration canceling effect. But the masses are lower of these smaller passives, and it's less of an issue. And the issue you run into is cosmetic, mostly, like having a woofer on the side of the box or a passive on the side of the box. You have to cover it up and come up with in our case, we painted the passive to match the box on the FR30 and FR20 to make it look more seamless. So it's really a cosmetic consideration to put it on the back. We still used kind of a premium material for the passive that's quite stiff. It's a Roacell foam core with carbon fiber skins, and we have a fiberglass skin also on the back. So it's quite stiff, and it's a flat piston. So it matches the woofer cone. But we tried to, partly to get the cost down a little bit, we tried to not do this lacquer painting and additional steps on it to side mount them and have it look a little cleaner. So it doesn't really affect performance. It's very slightly enclosure vibration down at 30 hertz, but that's not really where enclosure vibration colors the sound. It's really up in the mid range that you have to worry about audibility of resonances and stuff. So I think it was a good compromise on this unit, and I like how it turned out. And you can place them fairly near a wall, but for imaging and spaciousness, typically you want to have them out from the wall a little bit anyway with speakers. So that's kind of what's driving that more than the bass.
Okay. Because in any case, also the FR30 has rear tweeter, right? So
it does, yeah. It's defeatable. You can turn it off, but it's something that was a bit of a nod to old Infinity speakers. So Paul, when he founded a speaker company in the 90s called Genesis, they was with the founder of Infinity, and he has a lot of love for the older Infinity designs. In fact, has used them as a reference. And so our speaker is sort of an homage, I don't want to say imitation, but it takes some of the design ideas. Infinity pioneered the use of planar magnetic drivers in their speakers in HiFi. And so this is kind of a bit of a nod to what they're doing. It does add some spaciousness if you turn it on, depending upon the room acoustics and the distance from the walls. And it's kind of an effect, but I think we found that people like it. I'm not doing that on the smaller speakers because it's fairly expensive. It adds about $1,000 to the cost of the speaker to do all of that. And in the case of less expensive speakers, I feel like I would rather put the money into sound quality in other ways. So we're not incorporating that in the smaller models right now.
Okay. I was watching on PS Audio website, and there is a video that you are unboxing the FR10. It's a great idea to do an unboxing like that. Was your idea?
It was Paul's idea. I need to do more. I
Okay.
always get a little embarrassed on camera. He's very good on camera, but I
Speaking about the system, for
yeah
unboxing by yourself is really smart, actually.
yeah we tried to make it friendly for
Yeah.
customers. The out of box experience, how you feel about a product, starts from the second you start opening it. And if you can make it easy for people to get in and out of this, especially a heavy thing like a speaker, to
Mhm.
put some thought into how someone could, incorporate this into their system and room and not have to wrestle it out of the box so difficult. I think we came up with a pretty good system, and there was a surprising amount of positive feedback from that review. We got hundreds of people responding to it. About people like unboxing videos, I think, is what
Yeah.
I've found out. And it's nice to see that when people see there's a lot of thought put into packaging, it also makes them feel good about what's in the packaging, that maybe you put as much thought into the speaker or the product, whatever it is. So that was part of the I think the thing I discovered too there with that. So I hope to do more videos. It's actually the same packaging style that we have on the FR20, our larger speaker. I just hadn't done an unboxing for that, but that's how they come apart. And in the States, we don't always have a dealer coming to set up product at someone's home. A lot of it is direct to the consumer, and so it's got to be easy to open and easy to position the speakers, even though they're quite large.
Okay. And in the video, you are speaking about the crossover that you use. Are you guys are using film capacitors and
Mhm.
not electrolytic caps? Tell
Mhm.
me more about it because it's interesting. Why is it
Yeah.
important?
So the thing about um, crossover components is the sky is the limit. I could spend as
Mm,
much money on a couple of capacitors as the entire speaker is if you go to the extremes of what's available in the marketplace. But I think with all the designs, we've tried to use high quality components that still are high value. And in our case, capacitors are one of those things that um, if you use inexpensive ones, definitely add a negative sonic signature to a product. So we're using polypropylene metallized film capacitors everywhere, and ones that we've tried. It's not a boutique brand of that, but it's something that we found to be good performers. And same with the resistors we're using. We're not using sandcast resistors. We're using some wire on resistors that we like. And then the inductors we use none of them are iron core. They're all air core coils, which do not have saturation like what a cord inductor will have, which these cord inductors, even though they're smaller and less expensive and you can get in higher values, they add distortion of their own that's quite toxic actually. Like
mm,
an iron core inductor has very high order distortion that's almost like a square wave type distortion out of them when you start to saturate them. So they're not that you'd saturate them until fairly high power, but that was some of the components we use. We tried to part of the speaker sounding really dynamic is the stability of the crossover, that it sounds the same at higher levels as it does at lower levels. So that's getting
mm,
high voltage film caps and air core coils and things like that in there. In the case of designing the crossover, it's we do a lot of polar measurements and listening, and it's simulated on a computer, and then we build and check and go back and forth and listen, and to try to optimize the spatial response. So not only the direct sound from the speaker, but the sound going throughout the room.
mm.
So that's part of the methodology of where to put the crossover parts. We also use fairly high order filters. So planar drivers really don't like to play bass, at least the ones that we design. so that when we try to use the drivers in their optimal range and then cut them off rather steeply. So they're all fourth order acoustic filters, so which means they're 24 dB per octave. That's some of the thought behind it. You get wider coverage when you have a steeper filter as well. There are proponents of fewer crossover parts and shallower filters, but in our case, we found that with the drive units and the system design we have, it works better with steeper filters. So there's not still a ton of crossover parts in the system. It's all, in the case of the FR10, on one circuit board, whereas on the larger speakers, we split it up and have a little bit more components and have a separate base crossover unit. But we're able to simplify it here and make something, I think with good performance, but not overspend on the crossover. I think we have the right amount of high quality components on there. And that was kind of the goal, is when you're scaling a product down, I think, is to make the right decisions there. So
Great. So you guys have now FR10, 20, 30. We will see in the future maybe something smaller, FR5 or something like that.
Yeah, we're going to have a stand mount monitor with also 180 millimeter woofer, and then our tweeter, just a two-way monitor. We're pretty far along with that one. I have you should hear something from us in the next few months on that. So it's something I've been working on for a while. It's based off of the same woofer platform as we used in the FR10 for the bass, but we've changed the mid-range cone and improved performance for mid-range use. It does not have a separate planar mid-range like our other models do, but it's to try to make it a standard size, stand mount speaker. We still wanted to make good bass extension as a highlight of the unit, so you could potentially use them in a really satisfying way without a subwoofer if you wanted to. So that's part of the design goal on that one. But yeah, you should expect something from us pretty soon on that. I think that's going to end the line for us for now. I had hoped we would do a center channel at some point, but we're not really in the multi-channel home theater market as a brand, even though with speakers, you sort of end up there anyway, just because people have a lot of media rooms or TV surround systems where they want to incorporate their hi-fi. But for now, we're just doing these 4 models of product, and then we'll kind of see how it goes from there. And then I'm going to be moving on to some less expensive products and some subwoofers, I think is the plan. So
great. So FR5, it would be interesting to have it here at Met Audio Studio. I love to test a small speaker, because I have to every time to carry everything till the unfortunately don't have any elevator here, so it's always very, very hard.
Yeah, well, we'll get something. We should get a set too. These ones you can get up the stairs. They're not too bad. And they're just a pretty traditional sized.
Okay.
It's not a mini monitor, but it's a traditional sized stand mount speaker.
Something around 15 pounds or something like that, or
something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's not gonna be something you'll have to fight to get into your home.
Great. Super, Chris. Thank you very much for your time. There is something that you would like to add to this conversation?
Well, I'm just fascinated to hear your perspective and understand the market there a little bit more in Europe. I did go to the UK high-end show for the first time this last year and learned, it was great speaking with people there. There's a ton of great speakers being made, in the UK or in Germany or in various places. So it's a challenging market for us to break into, but I hope we get more people's ears on these products, that we're trying to make something compelling for people that would fit more in their homes with some of these smaller models. And I hope people give it a chance. But yeah, I would love to, any feedback you have for future products, or any of your listeners do, I'd love to hear it. We love the direct connection to the hobbyists and the enthusiast crowd and people wanting to talk.
Sure, I will. So, and any chance actually to see you guys to the High in Munich finally, or anything in plan?
I would like to go there. I don't think we're going this year. I know that our distributor has wanted to do it, but we haven't made the investment to be a part of it. And also when you're new to a show, you kind of start on the bottom rung of the ladder and you have to build up to get a decent room there. So it's going to be a while before we have a great showing. But Munich is really the show in the world
It's
for high-end.
expensive.
It's
It's really
amazing.
expensive. I know. Yeah.
But we're I hope we get there again. But I would love to just go walk the show too and see what everybody is doing, but maybe not for this year. I hope next year we could do it. But I know our international sales manager was really interested. Also, our distributor there has been great. It's been a long time partner. So, but I don't think we have plans for it this year.
Okay. Yeah, I'm always there because it's closer to me, It's 2 hour car away from me, so it's
Oh,
not
that's
so
nice.
expensive. I would like to come to any show in US, but it's too expensive for me at the moment. I would like to come maybe next year to the UK one. I hear that is very, very beautiful. And maybe we will
Oh.
see each other to the UK, because last year you was to the UK show, right?
Yeah, we had some challenges a couple of years ago with the Queen dying and the event being
Yeah.
hosted at
Yeah.
a venue that is owned by the royal family. So they didn't have it a couple years ago, but we had it last year and it was quite good. So I hope we'll be there again. So, and this
Oh,
was wonderful to chat with you. Yeah, if you have any feedback, I would love to hear it. It's Chris B.
sure.
So CHRISB as in boy at psaudio.com. If you guys ever want to chat about speakers or what your thoughts are, and it's great to speak with you.
Was great to speak with you also. And guys, if you have any feedback, please let it here in the comments. I don't know, it's a pretty new speaker, so I don't know if you maybe had the chance yet, but just let me know your feedback regarding the Aspen series and what you think about it. Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much,
Thanks so much,
and see you
everyone.
soon. Thank you for your time. Ciao, ciao.